Thank you for inviting me to speak here today. Just because I don't want to take credit for something I'm not responsible for, the maps Peter brought. So, I mean, they are beautiful. but in previous professional positions, I've had a chance to read reports on mishaps in our military, from training to combat. Without exception, there is never a single cause. Faulty intelligence, to give you an example, results in changing the time that an operation is supposed to begin. This forces new tactics that had neither been anticipated nor practiced. No one can prepare for everything. The accelerated schedule exposes men who would otherwise have gone unnoticed. The weapons they had planned to use are not well suited to the new circumstances. The terrain they're now required to traverse offers no cover. Visible, they become easy targets and suffer from enemy fire as a result. And many snafus are needed to cause a serious mishap. We're living in a period of multiple international snafus. Unlike the Soviet dictatorship whose Central Committee and Presidium could remove their maximum leader, Vladimir Putin rules much like the old czars, unchecked, except perhaps by an oligarchic plot whose prospects against a former KGB operative are not really good. The Russian currency continues to lose value. The price of the commodity that is the state's chief source of wealth continues its descent. Russian military planes overfly the Baltic states and its ships are deploying to the eastern Mediterranean. It has seized Crimea, as you know, and effectively invaded eastern Ukraine. An arc of jihadist violence and fellow travelers begins in Libya, curves north through Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, and dips into Afghanistan, whose neighboring state, Iran, also under economic pressure as a result of sanctions and falling oil prices, continues its nuclear weapons program. Iran, a jihadist state with nuclear weapons within its grasp, borders Pakistan, a nuclear power with jihadist ambitions. China's military budget holds to its double-digit increases annually. Their Navy added 37 ships last year and is on track to complete another 17 this year, which does not compare favorably with our own shipbuilding program that, although it produces better equipment, produces them in middling single digits annually. Meanwhile, Chinese rulers continue their salami slice approach to transforming the waters of its exclusive economic zone in the South and East China Seas into sovereign possessions. In simple terms, Russia is challenging the international order in actions on land that were familiar to European statesmen even after the mid-17th century Treaty of Westphalia. China is challenging the international order that sees the oceans as a commons from which all may benefit. And the jihadists, aiming at a return to the religious wars that preceded the Treaty of Westphalia, can be counted on to challenge the idea of nuclear balance that it was thought helped prevent nuclear conflagration during the Cold War. Adding importantly to these global fire hazards, U.S. diplomacy has shifted to its back foot and is reinforced in its lethargy by sequestration and budget cuts that the current administration's 3 secretaries of defense so far have warned are hollowing our military. A hollow U.S. military in today's world is a mass of crumpled paper under the tent of dry wood that is the deteriorated international environment. We live in a world that those who precipitated World War I would recognize at once. I'm particularly concerned about the Navy because its global dominance is the strategic backbone of the U.S.'s status as a superpower. Diminish American presence in the world's strategic areas, slash our ability to communicate with allies, shrink our role in protecting global freedom of navigation, eviscerate our capability to project combat power in the form of strike and amphibious force, and shrivel our global humanitarian and disaster relief services, and the U.S. loses both its ability to protect the homeland at a distance, along with our status as a great power. Sequestration and budget cuts have damaged the Navy as well as the U.S. military as a whole. And here, for the remainder of my short presentation, I'm going to defer, for the most part, to the public comments of mostly administration officials on the consequences of sequestration and budget cuts. There has been zero real growth in defense budgets since 2013. Take Secretary Hagel's word for it. As paraphrased by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bob Work, at a CSIS forum last month in November. The department, he said, cannot respond. This is Bob Work paraphrasing Chuck Hagel's remarks. The department cannot responsibly, efficiently, and effectively plan or strategize or implement national security policy with this continuing cloud of budgetary uncertainty hanging over our heads. So while the Navy has sought to take half of its 22 cruisers out of service, sequestration has prevented their being placed in a long-term modernization program amid distrust between Congress and the administration over the actual fate of the aging cruiser force. Sequestration is also affecting shipbuilding and maintenance. Before the Afghanistan war, the Navy had about 316 ships. It's now down to fewer than 290. Yet we are still deploying the same number of ships as when the U.S. possessed a 400-ship fleet. That's about 100. To preserve deployments at their previous level, ships spend more time at sea. So, ship maintenance is having trouble keeping up with ships that are wearing out faster. And this is what the current administration's Deputy Secretary, what Bob Work, said about that last month publicly. Quote, a smaller battle fleet coupled with unrelenting deployments to meet global demands is taking a serious toll. The material conditions of our carriers right now are not good. Generally, a carrier will go into an 11-month standard dry dock maintenance period. It's now taking about 16 months to get those carriers out because we're using them so hard. Again, this is Bob talking. It's now, there are actually 6 carriers in some sort of maintenance, more than half the total carrier force, and 9 amphibs, 1/3 of the amphibious force. Again, already forces that are out, we're able to keep them up. But the forces that would respond in a contingency are just not there. Now, the sea services also face a very severe strike fighter shortfall. This is a combination of the slip of the F-35 to the right, that is to say in delivery dates, and we're flying the wings off our older airplanes. So they're wearing out faster than we expected, and we're not getting the F-35 as soon as we wanted. So right now, it's really a problem. We have an awful lot of airplanes that are just waiting to get into depot, and we can't get them through fast enough. That's Bob Work. According to Janes, naval analysts, the United States' latest Virginia-class attack subs have missed deadlines because of cost-cutting on materials that have later led to faster wear and tear. Fewer ships to accomplish the same number of missions also affects morale. Longer deployments coupled with the threat of pay cuts and an improving economy have led many to leave the service. Again, I'd like you to hear what officials are saying. Testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee in March this year, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral John Greenert said, quote, fewer ships means we will wear out both ships and their men faster. Ships can be built within a decade, but it'll take you more than a generation if you wear this force out. And we've seen this before, and we have lived it twice, after Vietnam and in the 1990s. At a later meeting of the same committee, Senator Inhofe stated that, and this is a quote, these cuts have driven our military into a readiness crisis. Squadrons have been grounded. Ships have been tied to piers. Training rotations for ground forces have been canceled, while much-needed modernization programs have been delayed or simply canceled. And because of misguided, Senator Inhofe's words, fiscal priorities, we're now being forced to make false choices between paying our troops and their families what they deserve and giving them the training and capabilities required to accomplish their mission and return home safely. This, he said, is an irresponsible and reckless choice. These problems will sharpen in the future since, as both the Congressional Budget Office and Congressional Research Service have noted, the Navy's budget is insufficient to retain its current levels, let alone its planned size. Senator Inhofe echoed these nonpartisan organizations. Let me read the appropriate quote. The Navy, he said in March, needs to buy 10 ships per year to sustain the 300-ship fleet. That's with the expectation that each ship will last 30 years. Last year's budget brought 8. This year's budget will buy only 7. Admiral Greenert has stated that the Navy would need a 450-ship fleet in order to meet the needs of combatant commanders. A small fleet will lead to longer deployments, a very serious problem, and more strain on personnel and their families. Again, these are Admiral Greenert's words. Just this week, to say when he testified, Admiral Locklear, the commander of the Pacific Command, testified that submarine requirements in his area of responsibility are not being met while the U.S. is shrinking our submarine force. The Chinese are growing theirs, as well as developing new ballistic missiles, and will provide them with a credible second strike. It's kind of reminiscent of the 1990s. How can our allies and our adversaries take the pivot to Asia seriously when we aren't even adequately resourcing the requirements of our combatant commanders? Sequestration and budget cuts are not only a matter of money, but also of time. As Bob Work described it, so, he said, we're accused of saying, you're overblowing the problem. How can you possibly be in a readiness problem when you're not dumping that money into readiness? Now, that view is just plain and flat wrong. The effect in readiness is not like a blowout. It's more like a slow leak. And it started with slipping all our depot availabilities. It continues with a government furlough. It is exacerbated by a smaller force at extremely high demand. And the result of digging out of this is more of a matter of time right now than money because of the hole that we've dug. Again, the views that Admiral Greenert offered in March this year, quote, I'm troubled at the prospects of reverting to the Budget Control Act revised caps in 2016. That would lead to a Navy that is too small and lacking the advanced capabilities needed to execute the missions that the nation expects of the Navy. We would be unable to execute at least 4 of the 10 primary missions that are articulated in the Defense Strategic Guidance and the Quadrennial Defense Review, end of quote. Last month, some of you may have noted, a letter signed by 95 retired flag general officers warned Congress that the Navy is, these are their words, underfunded and overextended. A shrinking Navy, reduced readiness and retention issues are not the least of the Navy's problems. As Bob Work said at the CSIS Global Security Forum, if we go to sequestration, if we go to full sequestration, we will reduce research and development funding by another $23 billion over the next 5-year defense plan. Frank Kendall, who is the Obama administration's Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, estimates that this reduction would remove 4 or perhaps 5 major programs from our future inventory, further degrading our technological superiority, end of quote. Again, Bob Work, and I will conclude. He said last month that China's defense budgets will be as big as ours by the late 2020s, or maybe 2030. So our technological dominance is no longer assured. And by the way, I think Bob is right. If someone had suggested 20 years ago that China would gain the ability to target U.S. carriers underway at sea in the Pacific, they would have been dismissed as some kind of lunatic. Now we are taking the DF-21 missile seriously. In an article in the online publication Defense One, Representative Forbes warned last month that if we do not address budgetary issues, the balance of power in the West Pacific will continue to shift. This shift, as I mentioned at the beginning of these remarks, is driven by policy, both diplomatic and budgetary. The failure to honor self-created red lines complements budgetary decisions that have the effect described by executive and legislative branch officials whose words I believe are powerful, albeit neglected, warning of what is happening to America's role as a great power. Similarly elsewhere, the mild response to ISIL's beheading of Americans underscores the disappearance of what was once a powerful U.S. Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean. At the same time, U.S. leadership is absent in the face of Turkey's assistance to Hamas and ISIL, its violations of Cyprus's airspace, and exclusive economic zones. Just some examples. And the individual examples are not the point. The point is that respect for the United States is disappearing as a result of policy decisions, not the least of which is the deliberate policy of self-disarmament, which you asked me to talk about this afternoon. Thank you, and if there's time, I'm happy to try to answer questions, if you want me to.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Seth, for that rather sobering outlook on our Navy and its ability to meet the needs of the nation's security. Let me ask the first question, if I might, and that is, looking forward with the new Congress coming in January, what would it take, or does it look like there's any possibility to turn things around, and what would it take in terms of time, you know, given the lead time that's necessary for building and that sort of thing?
Well, the first thing thanks for the question. The first thing that would take is to reduce that gap that the Congressional Budget Office and the Congressional Research Service says exists between what the Navy plans to build and the money that can reasonably be expected in the shipbuilding accounts. So that would be a plus up to the shipbuilding accounts of something like $5 to $6 billion a year, which, you know, I mean, it's, as a percentage of the Navy's budget, it's not huge. It's a lot of money. As a percentage of the defense budget, it's obviously much smaller. In terms of national GDP, it's a rounding error. But I think that that's not, I don't think that's enough. I think that the Navy needs to consider very carefully its strategic direction right now, which is, I don't think, has completed the change from the one traditional naval mission of power projection to another traditional naval mission, which is now more important, and that is sea control. And that has a large effect on what kinds of ships we build. And I don't think that we've really taken, I don't think the Navy has really taken that into account. There's a lot more that could be done. Secretary Hagel was on to something, I think, when he said that the littoral combat ship needed to be more robust, have more robust defense and offensive capabilities than it does right now. That's an example of where sea control would be emphasized, make a difference. And generally speaking, the Navy's stewardship of its resources, especially in the shipbuilding business and the design, the construction, I think could be improved with large savings to the Navy's budget, and moving that up one level to the Defense Department. The Defense Department is run according to principles which Soviet planners would have been entirely comfortable with. And if those principles were reversed and more accountability was introduced into the entire management of the Defense Department, there are billions and billions of dollars that could have been saved.
Thank you. Dan? Go ahead.
So I detect an element of cognitive dissonance in the way you're talking. We're talking about what really would have to be done to get the Navy back on track, but the actual fights that are being waged and are not at all assured of being won are over keeping the number of ships at the inadequate level, which we would have to have big victories in the budget wars in order to win. I mean, to make an analogy with World War II, we're losing in the beginning part of World War II, but instead of proposing a big win, we're actually trying to secure, the very small victory in the out-of-the-way place. So it's a zero-sum game. If the Navy gets the resources that you were talking about, the rest of the defense establishment would also have to be increased, and it's actually even more expensive from the point of view of that. And we don't seem to be doing the basics. The F-35 seems like a disaster to an outsider, non-aviator outsider. But each of the parts of what we're doing, it doesn't sound like we're making progress in the way that you're talking about. And even if we do all of the shipbuilding to get to 10 ships a year, it's obviously inadequate, right? I'm very pessimistic.
Yeah, yes. There's nothing you said that I disagree with. Okay, my subject, I was asked to speak about the Navy. The points that you make about apply equally, budgetary points you make apply equally to the other services. And if there's going to be some kind of turnaround, then there's got to be a veto-proof way of putting that money into defense. I mean, that's a lot easier than finding a Secretary of Defense who's going to turn the way the department is managed around. That, we had one who could have done that, but then a war got in the way, namely Don Rumsfeld. But I don't see the prospects for that happening over the last 2 years of the Obama administration. It's not happening.
The back there.
This question, I'm just grasping for something hopeful. In the near to medium term, is there any significance in the emergence of the new laser and railgun developments?
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff going on there. You've mentioned two of them. Despite the accusations of gold plating on the Ford, it's going to be an extraordinarily advanced ship with several new technologies, leading edge technologies aboard it. There are the model shown by the Zumwalt class destroyer of electric drive and tremendous electrical generating capacity has lessons, I think, that could be learned and applied to exactly what you're talking about: rail guns and directed energy weapons. But you have to put them on something, and that something has to be paid for, and so that's a challenge. So, I mean, this would be a far darker picture if the answer to your question was, well, forget it technologically. But that's by no means the case. Although when the Undersecretary of Defense of this administration says that the budget cuts that he's looking at and the continuance of sequestration means that R&D is going to be put in a hole, that makes me nervous, and I assume it makes other people who are concerned about the nation's security nervous as well. But there are hopeful things, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your brilliant presentation. I have a question that does not relate to the Navy, but I was very intrigued by your reference to the Treaty of Westphalia. And it is obvious to me that the jihadists, well, the treaty, of course, created the modern nation state. It's obvious to me that the jihadists want to destroy the Western model of the nation state. And we have, unfortunately,
and the tolerance that the Treaty of Westphalia encouraged, that was part of their objective, yes.
absolutely. And unfortunately, we have conservative neo-anarchists who basically want to weaken the nation state here and in the West. I know it's kind of a bizarre question, but I want to know if you have any thoughts on that.
I'm against neo-anarchy and also against anarchy. I want to make sure that I go firmly on the record on that. Yeah, I don't know, but your point is, your point is a serious one. There's a lot of doubting about institutions that's a result of political gridlock, a result of the perception that government can't really perform. I wouldn't place it all at the doorstep of this administration, although I think much of it belongs there. But there's a certain stick in the muddedness on both on the part of both parties. I saw a bumper sticker the other day that said "Government is the enemy" or something like that. That's not just that's not a partisan sentiment. That's I mean, I don't think it's a widely shared sentiment, but when you start seeing things like that around, it's a sign of mistrust of institutions. That's a real problem, and I can give you my my thoughts on that, but I don't have time. So I thank you for your question.
All right, thank you very much, Seth.